So everybody, I'm gonna talk to you guys today about risk, specifically the shared nature of risk between the manufacturer of your AAD, CYPRES, and the end user of the product, like the individual skydiver. For 30 years, the CYPRES unit has saved people's lives, and it's proven in that time that it's very good at doing what it is built to do. But also in that time, skydiving has become more complicated, and it means that we're in the position where we need to know more about our units and interact with them more often. I've been working with CYPRES for some years now, and more I appreciate and understand how much effort and energy is put into calculating and analysing a lot of stuff that we perhaps don't consider that often as in our general use of skydivers. The term set it and forget it has been used by CYPRES and served very well for that time, and also still serves quite well for a lot of the skydiving that we do. But things get more complicated, and a lot of time is spent making sure that the parameters within which we skydive are as wide as possible, and the risks that we assume are as small as they can be. Basically, if something has a greater than 0% chance of happening, it means that CYPRES cannot disregard that as being too improbable to be irrelevant. Because if your business is building and selling a device upon which the stakes are people's lives, it's serious work, and a lot of thought has to go into it. If an incident happens and reports get filed, emails start flying around, sometimes government officials will turn up at the factory and people want answers. CYPRES can't really say, oh, that seemed like a really slim chance, so we didn't spend any time thinking about that. So they spend as much time as they can considering any and all eventualities. I'm going to go through the 4 main ways which you guys are most likely to interact with your units in general use, and give it a bit of background and talk about the parameters within which we operate and the risks that we trade off from one side to another, and then give it a bit of modern context and bring it up to date so that hopefully you guys you feel a bit more informed and you take something away feeling like this has all been worth your time. So these are the speed unit, speed mode. For the purpose of this, the 2 terms are interchangeable. It used to be the speed unit, and now it refers to the speed mode on the changeable unit. The wingsuit unit, offsets, and activation altitude. So we start with the speed unit, or speed mode. Parachutes were round, and they were crap, and then they were square, and that was much better, and everyone got really excited and learned how to swoop them. It became apparent that if you flew your parachute fast enough, you could potentially fire your CYPRES, and that was bad, so we needed a solution. The solution that skydivers had at the time was to not use it, either to jump without a unit or leave it switched off. But Helmut and everyone at the factory wanted everyone to be able to jump with the additional safety of having a CYPRES. So the solution was to release a unit with a faster firing speed. This was originally 96 miles per hour, and then in 2013 they raised it to 102, which meant that, like now, your swoops were safe again, so you could use the unit. But also, at the other end, there's a little bit of assumed risk. For example, if you had a high-speed malfunction, like a tangle or a partial inflation, you might be falling faster than 78 miles per hour, the default of the expert unit, but slower than 102, which would mean that if you had an expert unit in your rig, your unit would fire and your reserve would come out and save your life. If you had a speed unit, it wouldn't, because you weren't going fast enough. So our swoops are safe now at the assumed cost of some risk at the other end. These days, it's possible even to fire a speed mode unit with a very highly loaded, very small parachute, like a Peregrine, where it's like 102. So the solution is swoopers have gone back to their original idea of jumping with their unit switched off. If you're in the position of potentially being able to even fire a speed unit, it means that you're jumping a very highly loaded, very small parachute, and the experience you need to do that would mean that it's unlikely that you're going to clang your head on the side of the plane on the way out and knock yourself unconscious. But again, we're trading risks. The thing that it's perhaps most important to take away for more people is that it's entirely possible to fire an expert CYPRES with a 270 turn on a modern sport parachute like a Valkyrie. It's not easy, but you can do it, which means that the interacting with the speed mode and making a decision to use it is applicable to a much larger percentage of the skydiving community, because it's not just the province of a very small number of hardcore swoopers, it's now what we use for much more of skydiving. People come to me and say, CYPRES guy, should I put my unit onto speed mode? And I always say, I don't know, or should you? If you own a parachute and you're learning to swoop, you can afford to buy a device these days that will very precisely tell you how fast you're going. And if you apply the information you learn from that device, like a fly sight or a Takuni unit or something, you will save the cost of purchase with your swoop journey in the long run anyway. The point is, if you have the idea in your head of potentially needing to use the speed mode when you're learning to swoop, you can know the information you should need to know in advance and make the choice early. Quick video. So this is from Dubai from about 5 years ago. And remember this one? Yeah. It's unbelievable, right? So the point of playing this is that it doesn't matter how improbable something seems, someone out there in the world will find a way how to do it. Like Ralf Schwager is a very good skydiver, talented, experienced, current, jumping somewhere with proper oversight, but still it happened to him. He's talked about it down the line, and he said that he wasn't ignorant to it needing to be on speed mode. He literally thought it was. He just had multiple sets of gear, and he's swapping canopies and stuff like that, and it just sort of snuck through and got him. The point is, you don't have to wait for a miracle to develop the habit of interacting with your unit more and knowing more about what you need to do ahead of time. Do you think Ralf checks his unit is on speed mode every single time now? I'd say, yeah, he probably does, right? Okay, so the next one is the wingsuit unit. So wingsuits were invented and became commercially available, and everyone got very excited. People were getting better at flying them, and more importantly, they were getting bigger. If you were in, say, a flat spin in a big wingsuit, potentially you could be falling slower than the activation speed of your CYPRES, and then that spin would continue all the way into the ground. So we needed to have a solution. What people were doing was, with ever bigger wingsuits and ever smaller canopies, the difference in speeds, while that was traditionally easy to separate, the freefall part is fast and then the canopy part is slow, with bigger wingsuits and smaller parachutes, the speeds were becoming closer together and marginal and interchangeable. And in the case of XRW, even specifically, intentionally, exactly the same. And so CYPRES' solution was to release a unit that had different parameters for the wingsuit flight and then for the canopy. The idea being that when you deploy, you fly along before you pop your toggles for 10 seconds, and then your unit will switch from the slower mode, which is 45 miles per hour, to the canopy mode, which is back to the expert CYPRES speed of 78, or even it has a speed mode, which is great. So now your jump is safe again. But again, we're trading risks in a different area. So your jump is safe, but let's say you're a little overexcited and you don't wait for the beeps. The unit has a little ditto arrangement that beeps in your ear. So you fly along before you pop your toggles, the unit beeps, and then it's switched into canopy mode. If you pop your toggles too early and start flying your parachute, it might stay in wingsuit mode, which means that now you are at a greater risk of outflying your unit and firing your CYPRES, which is bad. These days, it is much more likely that if you're into wingsuiting, you've probably got a wingsuit-specific canopy, a 7-cell, like a low-pack volume thing. What people were doing was, as wingsuits were getting bigger, canopies were getting smaller and smaller, to the point where if you wanted to have a sensible parachute for wingsuiting, you need to have a whole separate set of gear or borrow something all the time, which is expensive and a pain in the arse. So people would just assume the extra risk of jumping with a smaller and smaller parachute, which meant that the parameters within which they were jumping and the risks they were trading were getting closer together. And so having a wingsuit-specific canopy meant that the parameters were wider again and things were safer. Quick video. Oh, it's got some noise. This is 2.5 minutes long. I realize that's much too long to play the whole thing of right now. Alex doesn't do anything wrong here. Someone hits him. But the point of playing this is that even in an intermediate wingsuit, it's gnarly, right? It's really fast. Do you guys want to watch the whole thing, or should we just skip to the end? It goes all the way to the ground. Did anyone see the sky surf guy jumping over the pyramids for doing the world record sky surf spins recently? He looks like that in the video, which is great. I mean, but it's quite a choice, you know. This guy, he's a fairly newer wingsuit jumper. They were on exit and they were trying to get close, and someone just hits him, so he's unconscious all the way down. Yeah, it's crazy. He looks like a. Oh, I knew someone would creep in with a beer late. There you are. Still going. So Alex doesn't remember the spin slowing down. He was unconscious all the way, but somehow, towards the end of the jump, the spin actually slows before his unit fires and it comes out. Okay, so he doesn't remember any of this. And so then he lands on the grass and he's fine. He's lucky. His face is all red like a beetroot from all the blood vessels bursting, but he was in hospital for a little bit, but he's fine. The point of playing it is that if you're into a particular thing, tools are available to help you minimize the risk and keep the parameters as far apart as possible, and the risks that you're trading from one side to another as small as they can be. Yeah.
Has there been say where once they look back at the data they've actually an expert unit work?
Yeah, I don't have details, but if you want, I can probably show you some stuff. Yeah. Whenever there's a save, CYPRES want to analyze as much of the data as possible because it helps with research and development. And so, imagine, yeah. Okay. So those two things are sort of discipline specific. The next two are sort of location specific, like sprinkled with a little bit of opinion. These are offsets and activation altitudes. The two things, what's going on? The two things are, we'll deal with that in a minute. That's all right. The two things cross over a little bit, and I've got a couple of examples that I'm going to use that are specific to this community. We'll do offsets first. So in-hops in the UK are less common. We have quite densely packed airspace, and also the fun police, they don't like it. But in a lot of other places, it's much more common. The in-hop guys here, right, there are events out in the world that are entirely based on doing in-hops, where you take off from somewhere and land somewhere else. There's two kinds of offset that you can put into your unit. One is where the place you are landing is lower than the place you took off from, and the other is the place you're landing is higher than the place you took off from. We'll do lower first. If the place you are landing is lower than where you took off, without putting an offset into your unit, for every 100 feet down you go, over the top, your CYPRES is going to fire 100 feet higher up. This means that there's a bit of a margin for electing whether or not to do an offset. And that crosses over into activation altitude in a minute, which we'll come back to. But it means you can elect, like, so if we've all got a parachute over our head at 3,000 feet like we're supposed to, that's fine, right? So 850, 950, 1050, etc. The specific example I want to use for this is Alvor Beach. Anyone jump there? EHP? Yeah, anyone else? Yeah, it's pretty popular with the Britons. When I did, they're jumping down there all the time now because due to local politics, you need 1,000 jumps to land at the airport, and so they're going to the beach all the time. When I did a beach jump there a few years ago, it was briefed to me as being 50 feet lower than the airport. But when I was fact-checking this and I approached someone who lives and works out there now, they told me it was exactly the same. And so, is there a difference between electing to not do an in-hop and electing to not do an offset and doing one? And so, the most important thing, I think, for people to know is, if you're doing like an in-hop jump somewhere, it's probably at the end of the day. There's a solid chance it's the last thing you do in the day. And to put the function in, it means you need to turn off your unit and turn it back on again, which means that the time that it will stay on, which is 14 hours, which represents the course of a jumping day, might mean that your unit is still on in the morning. Let's say you jump on the beach, then you're back at it the following day, and you're up early, you want to make the most of it. You think, oh, did I switch my CYPRES on? You look at it, it's on, great, off you go. But if it was on already, it means that at some point your unit might switch off and you're going to spend the rest of the day jumping unprotected by your CYPRES. Mostly, that information is either in the briefing or you realize, people come to me and be like, it's still on, CYPRES guy, it's broken, and they chase me around. And so, put yourself in the position of someone briefing up aircraft load after aircraft load of people going to the beach. 50 feet is an entirely marginal amount for electing to do an offset or not. It doesn't really matter. But, on the other hand, if you tell people it's the same to not do an offset, then you're eliminating or minimizing the risk of someone jumping through the following day after their unit has switched off and is not protecting them. So you're trading risks one against another. They're pretty marginal, they're quite wide, but also for a specific scenario based on where you are and what you're doing. The other offset is if the place you are landing is higher up than the place you took off from, it means that for every 100 feet, your CYPRES is going to fire 100 feet lower. This means that there's not really any margin for error and that you really need to do an offset because there's no room. You need it to not be any lower than it already is at default. So the quick example, this is Skydive Lucerne in Switzerland. This is the airfield. They have a regular in-hop that they do over here by this antenna. It's 360 feet higher up, which means that it's very important to do an offset. If you jump without doing an offset, it means that your unit's going to go off lower than 400 feet, which is not enough, and you need to do it. If you're doing an in-hop somewhere, the information that you need should be, and probably will be, in the briefing, as will the people following up to make sure that everyone has done the right thing, the load organisers and coaches going around checking that you've done the right thing. You can't rely on that, and no one's ultimately going to police it for you. Chances are it's fine, and everyone will do the right thing, and it'll all be present and correct. But also, there's plenty of places out there in the world where you're completely on your own about doing the right thing. People ignore me for days, and then 8 minutes before we all need to be in the plane, they chase me around the drop zone. Help me! How do we do it? So the point is that no one's going to do it for you, and all you need to know is the right information to make the right choice for yourself and what you're doing. The last one, and probably the juiciest in terms of opinions, is changing your activation altitudes. Does anyone have their activation altitude changed, set up a little higher? Some people? Yeah, okay. There are people in the world who will legitimately argue with me mostly, about if you don't have your activation altitude set like several hundred feet higher than the default, it's basically suicide. It's like a back in the day thing when skydiving used to be like a low pull contest all the time. That's not true. The default is specifically chosen as being as low as it can be while still being consistently effective. If you fire your CYPRES while you're sports skydiving, it's quite serious. It's not to be taken lightly. If you're conscious, you can avoid obstacles or land into the wind, but that's about it. It's going to save your life, and that's what it's for. The specific example I wanted to use about altering your activation height is if you're jumping somewhere where there's terrain around. I'm going to use Skydive bovettes for this. Anyone been to bovettes? Yeah, a couple people, yeah. It's good, isn't it? So it's at the southeastern edge of the Alps. It's relatively affordable. The drop zone is great. There's plenty of stuff to do. I know that some of the British groups have been trying to go out there. It's been tricky for the last couple of seasons, but the opportunities will present themselves because it's getting more and more popular. The first thing is the mountains around are 6,000 feet. So right off the bat, you're regularly pulling lower than the surrounding scenery, which is great. It produces imagery like this, amazing. If you stand at the hangar right here, and 90 degrees to your right, off towards the town, it's a touch under 1 kilometer before the terrain has risen up 100 meters or 300 feet. On the other side, past the river, it's the same story. It's a bit further away, but that's the side where the runway is, and that's the airspace that the airfield want to use. So you are specifically briefed and asked to plan and execute your jumps on the side where the town is. Realistically, there's plenty of space, but it's not difficult to be out of position on a tracking jump. And 1 kilometer is not that far. So you can imagine being in a scenario where you're out of position a little bit and you're over the terrain where it started to rise up underneath you, and having your activation altitude set a little bit higher might mean the difference between your reserve coming out and saving your life or not. So is there a trade? Is there a risk that we're trading from one to the other? If we all have a parachute at 3,000 feet, why not have your activation altitude set up all the time anyway? And this is what I just want to touch on, trading off the eventuality of one jump versus the possibility and probability of many jumps. For the one time that happens to me, that's great and it saved me. But then, if I have my activation altitude set higher, for every jump that I do, I'm bringing that closer to my regular pull altitude. Which is great. If we all have a parachute at 3,000 feet, that's fine, isn't it? But has anyone ever pulled low before? Has anyone ever flown through their final set of beeps where you're going to get told off now when you land, maybe? When it's like squealing in your ear? Has anyone ever been on like a tracking jump where at break off, you look at the person next to you and they're not breaking off, they're just looking at you going, yeah! I'm guilty of that, probably. Sometimes also my parachute will snivel for ages. So if you stack up those things, you can get to the point where you can imagine a scenario in which having your activation altitude set higher up means that it's the difference between maybe having 2 out. So again, you're trading risks from one eventuality to another, relevant to the circumstances that you're jumping in. For me, if I'm jumping somewhere where I know the terrain is flat in every direction, I will use the default, because I believe that if my CYPRES fires, it's more likely that I am unconscious than I've forgotten to pull. And in that scenario, I would rather be on the ground, because if I'm unconscious, I'm not choosing where I'm going to land anyway, so several hundred feet doesn't make a difference to me. And the minutes after something like that are crucial to how it all turns out. So I'd rather be down than fly off into the surrounding scenery for like hundreds of feet of canopy time. Saying that, if I jump above it, bet your ass that I'm going to put my activation altitude up a bit, because it's easier for me to imagine the scenario in which that's more important. The point is that it's your unit and you have access to it. You don't have to have someone tell you what to do and then just stick with that. Oh, you've got to set your activation altitude higher. You can choose what to do based on the scenario that you are in. If you're at home, you can use the default. If you go somewhere where there's terrain around, you can put it up. You can put it back when you go home. It's not easy to change it, so you can't do it by accident, but it's not difficult either, and it's up to you based on the scenario in which you jump and the parameters in which you are using. That said, here's a video of 2 professional skydivers forgetting to pull. Oh, I just wanted to talk about this real quick. Julian Barthel has some excellent work on how risks stack up on top of each other to create incidents and how to avoid them. He goes into it in a lot of depth with his Flight in Mind project, and it's worth looking at because it's applicable to a lot of skydiving we do, and shows you how things happen and how to avoid them. Okay, so here's a video. Oh, it's music. All right, well, whatever. So the point of playing this is it's the default altitude. And these guys are free flying, so they're at full speed. And this is what happens when it goes off at 750 feet, right? They were lucky, they were right over the top. I interviewed these guys and they said that the people on the drop zone who were packing out on the grass could hear them still in free fall coming down, yeah. For 30 years, the CYPRES unit has saved people's lives. It's proven in that time that it's very good at doing what it is programmed to do, but it won't think for you. And based on the locations that we have access to, the speed at which we learn, and the ever-growing complexity of the things that we do, mean that it's more important for us to know more things about how we use our units and interact with them more often. The term set it and forget it has served CYPRES very well for that time and continues to serve very well for a lot of the stuff we do. But based on your growing skills and your ambitions growing along with them, the parameters within which you're jumping can narrow, and the risks that you trade on either side can become more significant. It's not about having someone give you the answers. People come to me a lot and say, CYPRES guy, should I put my activation altitude up? My answer is always, I don't know. Should you? Should I do an offset? I don't know. Should you? You can be on the same plane, the same jump, doing the same thing as someone else, and your position might be different. Are you doing an offset? Yeah, why? Or is your activation altitude different? Yeah, why? It's not about knowing the answers, having someone give you the answers. It's about knowing the questions that you need to answer yourself. Then you can make the right choice for what you're doing. That's it. Thank you all for your time. Yeah.